John Marston is trying to outrun himself, and the whole tragedy of Red Dead Redemption is watching him slowly realize he never could. If you've played the game, you know what I'm talking about. John's not just fighting the government or hunting down his old gang members, he's fighting his own identity. The outlaw versus the family man, the killer versus the father, the past that shaped him versus the future he's desperately trying to build. And Red Dead asks this brutal, uncomfortable question: can you ever really change who you are? Or are you just the sum of everything you've done, carrying it with you forever, no matter how hard you try to be different? Today we're doing a deep psychological breakdown of John Marston. Let's get into it. The divided self. Outlaw versus family man. The psychological core of John Marston is this fundamental split in his identity. He's essentially two people occupying the same body, and they're in constant conflict. There's Outlaw John, the young man who rode with Dutch van der Linde's gang, who robbed banks and trains, who killed people, who lived entirely outside the boundaries of civilization because that was the only world he knew. That version of John understood loyalty to the gang, survival through violence, and freedom as the absence of rules. He was good at that life, maybe too good. And then there's Family John, the man trying to work a ranch in Beecher's Hope, trying to be a decent husband to Abigail who's stuck with him through everything, trying to be a father to Jack, to give him a different life than the one John had. This version wants normalcy, stability, to wake up, do honest work, go to bed without blood on his hands, to be boring in the best possible way. The problem is, these two versions of John can't coexist peacefully. Everything Family John is building is threatened by everything Outlaw John did. The past keeps showing up like a debt collector, and eventually it comes to collect. Now psychologically, what we're looking at here is identity fragmentation. That's when your sense of self is split into distinct, incompatible parts. And most people experience some version of this. We act differently at work versus at home. We have different aspects of our personality. But for John, the split is so extreme and so irreconcilable that he's constantly exhausted from trying to hold both identities at once. There's a developmental psychologist named Erik Erikson who mapped out stages of psychological development across the lifespan. And one of the crucial stages for middle-aged adults is what he called generativity versus stagnation. Basically, at this point in life, you're either creating something meaningful that will outlast you, or you're stuck, rotting in place, going nowhere. And that's John's psychological battlefield right there. He's desperately, almost frantically trying to generate something positive. A family that works, a ranch that produces, a legacy that isn't just a trail of bodies and broken promises. Because without that generativity, without creating something good, he's just stagnating in the moral decay of his outlaw past. He's just getting older while remaining the same violent criminal he always was. But the cruelty of his situation is that he can't escape the stagnation. The government literally won't let him. They show up and say, "We need Outlaw John back. We need you to track, hunt, and kill. And if you don't, we'll take Family John's family away." So he's forced to embody the exact identity he's trying to leave behind in order to protect the identity he's trying to build. Every time he picks up that gun, every time he tracks down another member of his old gang, every time he does what he's told because he has no choice, he's reinforcing Outlaw John, proving that Family John was always just a costume, a performance, something fragile that disappears the moment real pressure is applied. And you can see this split in how he talks about himself. When he's with Abigail or Jack, he talks about being different now, about having left that life behind. I ain't that man no more. But when he's out in the world doing the government's dirty work, slipping back into old patterns comes so naturally that it's almost frightening. The skills never left. The instincts are still there. Outlaw John was just dormant, not dead. That's the psychological horror of his situation. He thought he changed. He genuinely believed it. But change requires the world to let you be different. And the world looked at John Marston and said, "No, you're staying exactly what you've always been, whether you want to or not." Hunting ghosts, the shadow in his old gang. When the government forces John to hunt down Bill Williamson, Javier Esquella, and eventually Dutch van der Linde, the surface narrative is straightforward. He's following orders, getting his family back, doing what he has to do, but psychologically, something much deeper is happening. Each member of that old gang represents a specific part of John's own psyche that he's trying to destroy. Let's start with Bill. Bill Williamson was always the blunt instrument, the loyal soldier who followed orders without questioning them, who turned his capacity for violence into a kind of identity. And by the time John finds him, Bill's built his own gang in Mexico, ruling through fear and brutality. When John confronts Bill, he's confronting what blind loyalty can turn you into. Because John was loyal too. He followed Dutch into increasingly questionable situations. He did what he was told even when doubt started creeping in. Bill is the mirror showing John what he could have become if he'd never questioned, never left, never tried to be anything other than a soldier following orders, and killing Bill is psychologically necessary for John because it's destroying that part of himself. The part that wants simple answers, clear commands, the comfort of not having to think for yourself. But you can see it cost him. There's no satisfaction in it, just necessity. Then there's Javier, and Javier hits different because there was genuine friendship there. These were men who rode together, fought together, probably saved each other's lives more than once. But when it came down to choosing sides during the gang's collapse, Javier chose Dutch. He picked loyalty to a deteriorating leader over friendship with John. Hunting Javier means confronting betrayal, but not just Javier's betrayal of him, John's own capacity for betrayal. Because didn't John betray the gang by leaving? Didn't he betray Dutch's vision? Depending on how you look at it, John's either the reasonable one who got out or the traitor who abandoned his family when things got hard. Javier represents the friend who made different choices, and having to capture or kill him forces John to justify his own choices. To tell himself he was right to leave, right to prioritize his family over the gang, right to choose differently than Javier did. But you can hear the doubt in John's voice during their confrontation. The awareness that circumstances and luck separated their paths more than some fundamental moral difference. And then there's Dutch, the father figure, the philosopher outlaw, the man with the plan who John followed for years because Dutch made him believe they were building something better. By the time John catches up with him, Dutch is clearly broken, paranoid, delusional, spouting philosophy that's become completely disconnected from reality. He's living in a cave with a gang of Native Americans, ranting about civilization and freedom, planning one more score that will never come. Dutch represents the death of idealism. The reveal that the grand vision was always bullshit, or at least became bullshit somewhere along the way. And for John, confronting Dutch means confronting his own lost faith. Because John believed in Dutch once. He bought into the philosophy, the romantic outlaw vision, the idea that they were somehow noble in their criminality. Seeing what Dutch became forces John to acknowledge what he himself could have become. That paranoid, delusional figure still convinced he's right while the world burns around him. It's horrifying because it's familiar. In Jungian psychology, there's this concept of the shadow. It's everything about yourself that you don't want to acknowledge. The dark impulses, the violent tendencies, the selfishness, the capacity for cruelty. Everyone has a shadow, but most people spend their lives pretending it doesn't exist or projecting it onto others. And John's old gang is his shadow externalized. They embody every dark aspect of himself that he's trying to repress. Bill is his violence and blind loyalty. Javier is his capacity for betrayal and moral compromise. Dutch is his lost idealism turned toxic. They're parts of him walking around outside his body, and hunting them down is symbolically hunting the darkness in himself. But here's what makes this psychologically tragic. You can't actually kill your shadow. You can only integrate it, accept that it's part of you. Learn to acknowledge those dark impulses without being controlled by them. John never gets to do that integration work. He keeps fighting his shadow, destroying its external manifestations, but never making peace with it internally. So the shadow keeps winning. It pulls him back into violence over and over until there's nothing left of family John except the desire to protect his family in those final moments. The body keeps the score, living with complex trauma. Let's talk about what years of outlaw life actually did to John on a neurological and psychological level. Because he's not just a guy with a complicated past. He's displaying clear symptoms of complex trauma, and it shapes how he moves through the world every single day. Complex PTSD is different from regular PTSD. Regular PTSD usually comes from a single traumatic event. Complex PTSD comes from prolonged, repeated trauma, usually starting early in life and continuing over years, and John's background fits that perfectly. Orphaned young, raised in a criminal gang, decades of violence and survival, watching people die, killing people himself, never experiencing real safety or stability until he tries to make a life with Abigail. Watch how John moves through the game's world. He's hyper-vigilant, always scanning his surroundings, never fully relaxed even in supposedly safe spaces. When he's on his own ranch, supposedly home, supposedly secure, he's still alert, still ready. His nervous system never actually believes he's safe because it's been trained by decades of real danger that his safety is an illusion. That's not paranoia, that's a trauma response. When you've lived through enough situations where letting your guard down meant death, your nervous system gets stuck in threat detection mode. It's like an alarm system that can never be fully turned off. And John's alarm has been screaming for so long that he doesn't even notice it anymore. It's just how he exists in the world. Then there's the emotional numbing. John kills dozens, probably hundreds of people throughout the game, and there's no joy in it, but there's also no real horror. He's dissociated from the violence. It's become mechanical, procedural. He shoots people the way someone else might chop wood, just something that needs doing. This is what chronic exposure to violence does psychologically. Your mind can't process that level of trauma in real time, so it creates distance, dissociation. You're doing terrible things, but you're not really there. You've separated your actions from your emotions as a protective mechanism, and over time, that separation becomes permanent. But the emotions don't just disappear, they go somewhere. And for John, they show up as this constant undercurrent of guilt and exhaustion. He doesn't talk about it much because John's not a talker. He's not someone who processes things verbally, but you can see it in quiet moments. The way he looks at Jack sometimes, like he's terrified of what his son might become. The desperation in his interactions with Abigail, needing her to believe he's changed. The moments where he just seems profoundly tired of everything. There's also intrusive guilt. Moments where the past breaks through. When he talks about the things he's done, there's this flatness to his voice that's not indifference. It's the emotional equivalent of scar tissue. He's been over this territory so many times that he's numb to it, but the guilt is still there underneath. From a trauma theory perspective, John's entire redemption quest is a coping mechanism. He's trying to atone through action. By following the government's orders, by hunting his old gang, by doing terrible things for supposedly good reasons, he's attempting to rewrite his moral narrative, to prove he's on the right side now, to balance the scales somehow. But trauma doesn't work like that. You can't balance out violence with more violence. You can't atone for killing by killing different people. That's not how healing happens. Real trauma recovery requires processing, integration, making meaning of what happened in a way that allows you to move forward. And John never gets to do that work. He's stuck in this loop of action and reaction, never actually addressing the underlying psychological damage. The cruelest part is that every step toward his supposed redemption requires him to fully embody his trauma, the tracking skills he learned as an outlaw, the shooting, the violence, the ability to read situations and people and know when death is coming. All the survival skills that were forged in trauma are the exact tools he needs to supposedly transcend that trauma, so he can never actually leave it behind. It's not in his past, it's in his body, his reflexes, his instincts. Outlaw John isn't a former identity, it's his nervous system, and nervous systems don't forget. The paradox, seeking peace through violence. Let's sit with the central contradiction of John's redemption arc, because this is where the psychological tension becomes almost unbearable. John wants peace. He wants to be a family man, a rancher, someone who solves problems through work and words instead of bullets. That desire is genuine, it's not a performance. But every single step toward that peace requires violence. The government won't give him his family back unless he hunts down Bill, Javier, and Dutch. He can't protect his ranch without guns. He can't keep Abigail and Jack safe without being willing to kill anyone who threatens them. So he's trapped in this paradox. The only way to achieve peace is to be extremely good at violence. The only path to redemption runs through more bloodshed. The only way to protect Family John is to unleash Outlaw John one more time. This is cognitive dissonance at its most psychologically damaging. Cognitive dissonance is what happens when your beliefs and your actions don't match up, when you're doing things that contradict your values or your self-image, and it creates this intense psychological discomfort that people will go to extreme lengths to resolve. Most people resolve cognitive dissonance through rationalization. They change how they think about their actions to make them align with their self-image. I'm not really doing anything wrong. This is justified. I had no choice. And John does this constantly. He tells himself he's doing this for his family, that he's being forced, that these are bad men who deserve what's coming, that once he finishes this last task, he'll finally be free. But underneath the rationalizations, you can see the dissonance eating at him. The way he responds when Abigail questions what he's doing. The anger that flashes when anyone suggests he's just fallen back into his old life. The desperate need to believe his own justifications. Because the alternative is admitting a terrible truth. Maybe he can't change. Maybe the world won't let him. Maybe the skills and instincts that made him an effective outlaw are the only things he's actually good at. There's this existential philosopher named Jean-Paul Sartre who wrote about bad faith. It's a specific kind of self-deception where you pretend you don't have freedom and agency, where you tell yourself, I have no choice, when actually you're choosing, you just don't want to admit it. And John lives in bad faith throughout most of the game. He tells himself the government is forcing him, that he has no choice, that this is being done to him rather than something he's actively participating in. But does he really have no choice? He could refuse, he could run, he could fight the government instead of his old gang. These are all options, terrible options with terrible consequences, sure, but they're choices. The truth John's hiding from is that he's choosing the path of violence because it's the path he knows. It's comfortable in a sick way. He knows how to track and shoot. He doesn't know how to navigate bureaucracy or legal challenges or any other way of resisting what's being done to him. So he falls back on his outlaw skills because they're reliable, and then he tells himself he had no choice to avoid confronting the fact that he's still, fundamentally, the same violent man he always was. But there's another layer to this bad faith, because while John's deceiving himself about his choices, he's also genuinely trapped. The government really will take his family if he refuses. The system really has him cornered. So is it self-deception to say he has no choice, or is it just accurate assessment of his situation? That ambiguity is what makes his psychology so complex. He's both choosing violence and being forced into it, both falling back into old patterns and having those patterns demanded of him. The self-deception and the genuine lack of options exist simultaneously, and that's psychologically exhausting. Living in that space where you can't quite tell if you're a victim or a participant, if you're being your authentic self or performing a role, if you've really changed or if you've just been waiting for an excuse to stop pretending. Moral evolution, from survival to sacrifice. Let's track John's moral development over his lifetime, because it's actually a journey, even though it ends in tragedy. Understanding that journey helps explain why his final choice means what it means. In his early life with Dutch's gang, John was operating at what developmental psychologist Lawrence Kohlberg would call the pre-conventional stage of moral reasoning. That's the most basic level where morality is entirely about punishment and reward, about self-interest and survival. Young John's moral logic was simple. Loyalty to the gang means safety and belonging. Betrayal means you get killed. You do what Dutch says because Dutch is the boss, and going against him has consequences. You rob and kill because that's what puts food on the table. The rightness or wrongness of actions is determined entirely by their practical outcomes for you personally. This isn't unusual for someone raised in those circumstances. When you grow up outside normal society, outside the social structures that teach conventional morality, you default to this basic calculation of self-interest. Then John tries to go straight. He marries Abigail, they have Jack. He attempts to build a ranch and live honestly, and his moral reasoning shifts to what Kohlberg called the conventional stage. This is where most adults operate. Morality based on social norms, laws, duty, maintaining relationships, and social order. During this period, John's defining himself through external standards. Being a good husband means providing for your wife and not straying. Being a good father means teaching your son right from wrong and keeping him safe. Being a good citizen means following laws, working honest jobs, not causing trouble. His moral framework is entirely external. He's trying to be what society says a good man should be, and that works okay as long as the system cooperates, as long as following the rules actually leads to the life he wants. But then, the government shows up and breaks the system. They tell him, "We don't care about your honest life, we need you to kill for us." And John's conventional morality has no answer for that. What's the dutiful thing to do when authority itself is unjust? What's the lawful thing to do when the law is being used to coerce you? This moral crisis is what forces John towards something deeper, toward what Kohlberg called post-conventional morality. That's the highest stage where moral reasoning is based on universal principles, on self-chosen values independent of external authority or social expectations. And you see this evolution most clearly in John's final stand at the ranch. Think about his situation in those last moments. The government has betrayed him. They used him to eliminate his old gang, and now they're coming to eliminate him. By any practical logic, by any calculation of self-interest or even conventional duty, John should run, should grab his family and disappear. The law has revealed itself as unjust, so there's no moral obligation to submit to it. But John doesn't run. He sends his family away, and then he faces the government agents alone. Not because the law demands it, the law is coming to murder him. Not because society expects it. Society doesn't care what happens to an ex-outlaw. He does it based on a self-chosen principle that transcends both self-interest and social convention. The principle is simple. Protect your family at any cost. Give them time to escape. Sacrifice yourself if necessary. That's post-conventional morality. John's not following external rules anymore. He's acting from his own deeply held values about what matters and what's right. The government calls him a criminal, but he knows he's not. Society says he's worthless, but his family knows different. And in that moment, his own moral compass is the only one that matters. This is moral awakening. For the first time maybe in his entire life, John's not acting out of self-interest, not following orders, not trying to live up to external standards. He's acting from authentic principle, from love, from a clarity about what really matters when everything else is stripped away. And it costs him his life. But psychologically, morally, it's the moment he becomes fully himself. Outlaw John and Family John finally align. The violence is in service of love. The sacrifice is chosen, not imposed. He's not a victim or a criminal or a tool. He's a father making a choice. The American shadow, the myth he embodies. There's something bigger happening with John Marston beyond just one man's story. He represents an archetype that's deeply embedded in American culture and the American psyche. The gunfighter seeking redemption, the violent man trying to become gentle, the outlaw who wants to be respectable. This is a myth that America tells itself constantly. It's in Western films, in frontier stories, in the national narrative about how the West was won. The idea that violence was necessary to build civilization and that the men who committed that violence can somehow be redeemed once civilization is established. But there's a deep psychological tension in that myth because it requires believing two contradictory things at once. First, that violence was justified and necessary and even noble in its context. And second, that the men who committed that violence can put it behind them and become peaceful citizens once it's no longer needed. John embodies both sides of that contradiction. He's the man who did terrible things for survival, for loyalty, for what seemed like good reasons at the time. And he's also the man desperately trying to prove that those things don't define him, that he's more than his worst actions. But the myth is a lie. And the game makes that devastatingly clear. Society needs violent men like John to do its dirty work, to clear out the outlaws, to establish order, to eliminate threats. But society doesn't want those men around once the work is done. They're too dangerous, too unpredictable, too much of a reminder of the violence that built everything. So John exists in this impossible psychological space. He's too violent for civilization. His skills, his instincts, his entire identity is built around survival through force. But he's also too civilized to be an outlaw anymore. He wants family, stability, meaning beyond just surviving another day. He's rejected by both worlds, and the resolution to that impossibility is his death. The myth requires the gunfighter to die so that civilization can continue without him. It's a purification ritual. The violence that built society must be eliminated before society can pretend it was built on anything but blood. That's psychologically heavy because it suggests that some forms of damage are permanent. That some men are so shaped by violence that redemption requires their removal from the world entirely. Not because they're evil, but because they represent something civilization wants to forget about itself. John's death becomes almost mythological in that sense. The sacrifice of the gunfighter so that the next generation can live in peace. He dies so Jack can have a different life, so Abigail can remarry someone respectable, so the world can move forward without the inconvenient reminder of how it was made. And John understands this on some level. You can see it in how he talks about Jack, about the future, about the world changing. He knows he's a relic, a man from a dying era who can't adapt to what's coming, and there's this profound sadness in that awareness. The final integration, becoming whole in death. Let's talk about those last moments in detail, because psychologically, this is where everything John's been struggling with finally resolves. The government has come to kill him. Ross and his men surround the ranch. John knows what's happening, and he has a choice. He could fight his way out. He's capable of it. He could run, disappear, start over somewhere else. He could hide inside and wait them out. Instead, he tells Abigail and Jack to run. He gives them his horse. He sends them through the back while he prepares to face the agents alone. And when Uncle gets himself killed trying to help, John walks to the barn, pushes open those doors, and faces the firing line. What's happening psychologically in that choice? First, it's acceptance. John spent the whole game trying to outrun his past, but he finally accepts that he can't. The government will keep coming. His reputation will keep attracting trouble. The world won't let him be Family John in peace. So he stops running from that truth. But it's not resignation or defeat. It's acceptance in the existential sense. Acknowledgement of reality as it is, not as he wishes it were. And from that acceptance, he makes a conscious choice about how to meet that reality. Second, it's integration. For the first time in maybe his entire adult life, Outlaw John and Family John aren't in conflict. They're aligned. He's using all his outlaw skills, the courage, the marksmanship, the willingness to face death, for the most righteous purpose possible. Protecting the people he loves. The violence and the love finally point in the same direction. This is what Jungian psychology calls integration of the shadow. You're not pretending the dark parts of yourself don't exist anymore. You're not trying to kill them off or repress them. You're acknowledging them and choosing when and how they manifest. John's using his capacity for violence consciously, deliberately, in service of something he values more than his own life. Third, it's the reclamation of agency. Throughout the game, John's been pushed around. The government forced him to hunt his old gang. Circumstances forced him back into violence. Other people's choices and systems and pressures determined what he did. But this final choice is entirely his own. The government wants to arrest or kill him quietly, but he controls how he dies. He decides it will be facing them directly, giving his family time to escape, going down fighting rather than running or hiding. There's a philosopher named Albert Camus who wrote about the absurd hero. The person who faces a meaningless, hostile universe but creates meaning through their choices anyway. Like Sisyphus pushing his boulder uphill forever, but choosing to do it with dignity and even joy because the struggle itself gives life meaning. John is that absurd hero in his final moments. He knows the system is rigged against him, knows redemption was always impossible, knows he's going to die, but he chooses to make that death mean something. He transforms it from murder into sacrifice, from the government eliminating a loose end into a father protecting his family. And in that transformation, he becomes whole. Not because he escaped his past or proved he'd changed or achieved redemption in any conventional sense, but because for one moment, everything he was, the outlaw and the father, the killer and the husband, the violence and the love, the past and the future, all of it came together in a single coherent choice. He died as a complete person, and that's the only wholeness he ever got. John Marston couldn't outrun himself, couldn't kill off his outlaw past, couldn't find redemption through any of the paths the world offered him. The government used him and betrayed him. Society rejected him. His old gang was gone, and the peaceful life he wanted was always just out of reach. But in the end, standing in that barn doorway with the sun at his back and certain death ahead, he found something more important than redemption. He found integration, authenticity, a moment where all the fragmented pieces of himself aligned into one final choice that meant exactly what he needed it to mean. His psychology was defined by fragmentation, by the war between who he'd been and who he wanted to be, by complex trauma that rewired his nervous system for permanent vigilance, by cognitive dissonance between his values and his actions, by the desperate attempt to generate meaning and legacy from a life built on violence. And his tragedy is that he never got to live as a whole person, never got the peaceful ranch life, never got to just be a father and husband without the past constantly threatening everything. He only became complete in death, and even that completeness lasted maybe 30 seconds before the bullets came. Red Dead Redemption asks whether people can really change, and through John, it gives us a complicated answer. He did change. He became capable of deep love, of sacrifice, of moral clarity. He evolved from self-interested survival to principled choice, from conventional morality to post-conventional values. But the world wouldn't accept that change, wouldn't let him live differently. Society needed him to be the violent man when it served their purposes, and then needed him gone when he'd outlived his usefulness. The myth of the redeemed gunfighter requires the gunfighter to die. That's the price of the myth. So maybe the real question isn't whether people can change, it's whether the world can see that change, whether systems built on violence can accept non-violence, whether a man's past can ever truly be past, or if it's always present, always defining him, always determining his fate. For John Marston, the answer was tragic, but he died trying, died choosing, died protecting what mattered, and maybe in a world that won't let you be anything but what you've been. That's the only redemption anyone gets. Thanks for watching.